Hey guys, tonight we step barefoot into the grasslands of 19th century southern Africa, just as the clouds start to gather over a kingdom that's not quite on your history teacher's radar. You hear the rhythmic stomp of British boots, smell the dry earth curling under colonial heels, and, if you squint, you'll spot the shimmer of spears lined in geometric silence beyond the horizon. Welcome to the Anglo-Zulu War, or as I like to call it, how to lose an empire before lunch. You probably won't survive this, not because of the assegais, but because of the sheer weight of what they never told you in school. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing how far this little bedtime history pod travels. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing at the edge of the British Empire's ambitions, somewhere around late 1878, and it feels like the world is holding its breath. To your left, the colony of Natal, stiff with British bureaucracy and afternoon tea. To your right, Zululand, sovereign, proud, and very much not looking for a fight. But behind you, a whole century of European imperialism, huffing and puffing to blow the last free African kingdoms down. There's smoke rising in the distance, but not from war. Not yet. It's from cooked fires, cattle herders, and the breath of a nation that has existed long before British maps acknowledged it. You can hear the low thrum of drums and the occasional bark of command in Isailu, a language that rolls like thunder over the veldt. Meanwhile, somewhere in Cape Town, Sir Bartle Frere, British High Commissioner and professional empire flatterer, is sharpening his pens and plotting his next annexation. He's the kind of man who says things like moral duty while oiling the gears of conquest with economic spreadsheets. You get the feeling he'd send a letter bomb if it came with proper postage. And guess what? You're right on time for his latest bright idea. The British have a bit of a problem, though you'd never know it from the brass buttons and fanfare. You see, they've recently gobbled up the Transvaal, a Boer republic full of cantankerous Dutch settlers who absolutely hate being told what to do. To pacify them and justify that imperial appetite, Frere needs a common enemy. Enter the Zulu kingdom. It's a little awkward, though. The Zulus haven't actually done anything wrong. In fact, they've spent the last decade under King Cetshwayo minding their own business, reinforcing old military systems, and enforcing a very strict no-violence policy across their borders. Cetshwayo is the kind of ruler who'd rather outmaneuver you politically than stab you in the dark. Though yes, he will absolutely stab you if you make him. But that doesn't matter. To the Empire, the Zulu kingdom is a glittering problem. Not only is it powerful and independent, but it also exists right next to British territory. That's like leaving your last slice of pizza in the fridge with a sign that says, "Do not eat." You know how that ends. Frere begins whispering to London about how the Zulu pose a grave threat to regional peace, despite there being exactly 0 Zulu incursions at this point. He crafts this narrative with the precision of a playwright and the cynicism of a tax auditor. He starts hinting that unless someone, let's say the British, intervenes, the entire region could dissolve into barbarism. Spoiler alert, no one in Zululand is actually rioting. The Zulu military, by the way, is terrifyingly efficient. Built on Shaka Zulu's original reforms from the early 1800s, the army is structured by age-grade regiments called Amabutho. You're not just handed a spear and told to try your luck. Oh no, you're trained to move in silence, charge in coordinated waves, and fight under strict discipline. You don't even get to marry until you've served. But despite that formidable setup, the Zulus have no artillery, no horses, no guns, really, unless you count the handful of muskets captured from past skirmishes. In British eyes, this makes them primitive, which is ironic, because in about 2 months, that primitive system will dismantle a modern army in broad daylight. Of course, this part isn't in the imperial memos. Here's a quirky tidbit most people miss. The British Empire in southern Africa at the time is less of a solid structure and more like a Jenga tower built during an earthquake. Different colonies have different rules. Different governors have different motives. And communication with London? Slow enough to age cheese. In this chaos, Frere starts laying out his chessboard. His pieces? Paper ultimatums, false border disputes, whisper campaigns, all designed to paint the Zulu as irrational aggressors. The truth? Most Zulu warriors are still harvesting grain and debating marriage prospects. And yet, Frere builds tension like a man lighting match after match, waiting for the wind to catch. Meanwhile, you've got colonial newspapers fanning the flames. Articles describe the Zulu as warlike savages, despite no major Zulu-led conflicts in recent years. It's almost comical, like describing Switzerland as a nuclear threat because they wear camouflage on weekends. But propaganda is powerful. And oh, it works. The British troops? They're not exactly a dream team. Many are young recruits with barely 6 weeks training. Some are conscripts. Others are soldiers of fortune from random parts of the empire. And they're about to march into unfamiliar territory during peak malaria season wearing wool uniforms. Genius. And so you stand there, watching the wheels begin to turn. You hear horses neighing at the supply post. You see crates of hardtack and Enfield rifles stacked on wagons. You smell iron polish and damp canvas. But you also feel the unease. Even the officers can't shake it. There's a gap between what they've been told and what their instincts scream. You overhear one officer joke, "It'll be over by Easter," which is exactly what they said in 1914, by the way. Funny how that works. Historians still argue whether Frere acted alone or had secret backing from the British Crown. Some think he went rogue. Others believe he was the Empire's unofficial blunt instrument. What we do know is that his invasion was illegal. Parliament hadn't authorized war. There was no formal declaration, just an ultimatum and a ticking clock. At the heart of all this is the looming shadow of imperial confidence. The kind that says, we've got rifles, they've got sticks, what could possibly go wrong? A lot, as it turns out, because you're about to follow a column of red-coated soldiers into a land they don't understand, to fight people they underestimate for reasons they never fully grasp. And as the smoke on the horizon rises, curling like a question mark above the felt, you can't help but feel that something ancient and fierce is watching, waiting. Maybe it's a warrior. Maybe it's history itself. You're sipping warm tea at a colonial outpost, listening to 2 British officers complain about the heat and the uncivilized landscape, as if the grass itself should be ashamed for not growing in neat English hedgerows. One is polishing his boots obsessively. The other's pretending not to notice the local scout giving him side-eye from the doorway. Neither realizes they're about to be pawns in a far bigger, dumber game. That game? A war built not on strategy or defense, but on greed, ego, and paperwork. Lots of paperwork. This is where you meet Sir Bartle Frere again, mid-pen stroke, drafting what might be the most passive-aggressive colonial stunt of the decade. Frere is all starch collars and moral superiority, the kind of man who speaks of empire as a burden the British nobly carry, like dragging a sofa up a mountain they don't even live on. He's decided, with very little input from London and even less from Zululand, that the Zulu kingdom must be dealt with. Frere isn't just acting on whimsy. He's got an agenda stacked as high as a giraffe's worries. First, there's his dream of a unified South Africa under British rule, something like a colonial IKEA build, except with more conquest and fewer instructions. The Zulu kingdom? It's an obstacle, an annoying, inconvenient, sovereign one. It's also sitting on prime land. And while we're being honest, it has a strong, disciplined army that terrifies both British colonists and the recently conquered Boers. So, naturally, Frere's solution is to invent a threat. And invent he does. He crafts a narrative where Setshwayo, Zulu king and actual adult in the room, is recast as a tyrant waiting to unleash chaos on the white settlers. Never mind that Cetshwayo has spent most of his reign calming local tensions, maintaining cross-border peace, and keeping his warriors from indulging in the occasional cattle raid. To Frere, peace is a detail. War is the goal, and war needs a reason. Enter the boundary dispute. Cue dramatic music. It starts with a minor land disagreement involving the Boers, the British, and some contested grazing territory near the Tugela River. The kind of problem that could have been settled over tea and dry biscuits. But Frere spins it into a full-blown crisis. He insists that Cetshwayo is poised to invade, that the Zulu army is gathering, that lives are at stake, even though on the ground, no one's seen a single Zulu spear crossing the line. This is where it gets cheeky. Frere sets up a commission to investigate the boundary issue. The commission finds, awkwardly, that the land in question belongs to the Zulus. But instead of accepting that, Frere tucks the report under his pile of ignored facts and decides to issue an ultimatum to Cetshwayo anyway. This is like someone bumping into your shopping cart, then demanding you hand over your groceries or else. The ultimatum is delivered on December 11th, 1878. You're sitting in a canvas tent, the rain outside drumming a lazy war beat on the roof. The British delegation, dressed like they're attending a royal luncheon, hands over a list of demands so outrageous you almost laugh. One clause demands that Cetshwayo disband his army in 30 days. Another insists he allow Christian missionaries full access to his kingdom. Oh, and he's supposed to accept a British resident advisor too. Just to keep an eye on him. It's not diplomacy. It's a setup. You picture Cetshwayo receiving the document. Broad-shouldered, dignified, a man who knows when he's being insulted. He doesn't scream. He doesn't threaten. He simply sends word back that these demands are impossible. Historians still argue whether Frere wanted Cetshwayo to refuse. Some say he believed the Zulu king might fold under pressure. Others insist Frere engineered the ultimatum specifically to be rejected, so he could justify his invasion. Either way, the countdown begins. And this is where the weird stuff starts. Because while Frere is lighting matches in the bush, London is asleep, figuratively and literally. Queen Victoria has no idea war is about to erupt in her name. Parliament hasn't approved it. The Secretary of State for the colonies is only vaguely aware of the tension. But Frere? He's already mobilizing troops. It's the colonial version of ask for forgiveness, not permission. You follow the British columns as they assemble. It's a strange mix. Regular army regiments, colonial volunteers, native levies, ox-drawn wagons, and piles of awkward assumptions. The men carry Martini Henry rifles, single-shot breech-loaders that are powerful, yes, but painfully slow to reload. Their uniforms are bright red. Their supply chains are fragile. Their maps of Zululand are vague sketches filled in by rumor and optimism. Meanwhile, Cetshwayo waits. He doesn't mobilize immediately. He holds counsel, weighing the options. He sends messages to neighboring chiefs, tightens internal discipline, and prays for time, perhaps, or for sanity. But he knows what's coming. He's seen it before. The British offer a hand with one palm and a fist with the other. There's something quietly heroic about his patience here. He could have struck preemptively. He could have sent his impies across the border under cover of night. But he doesn't, because deep down, Cetshwayo still thinks diplomacy might prevail. It won't. Meanwhile, in colonial outposts, gossip spreads. You hear exaggerated stories of Zulu warriors with magical shields and fireproof skin. One settler swears he saw a man ride a buffalo like a horse. None of it's true, of course, but fear rarely needs facts. It just needs repetition. And then Frere makes his move. He informs Lord Chelmsford, the British commander, that the deadline for the ultimatum has expired. On January 11th, 1879, the British invasion of Zululand officially begins. Without approval, without declaration, without even a coherent plan. Just a lot of redcoats and bad maps. You cross the Buffalo River with the main column, your boots sinking into soft earth. The air smells of dust and something ancient, like time itself, is watching. Zululand isn't just a place. It's a living, breathing presence, and it doesn't take kindly to arrogance. You pass villages, their inhabitants gone quiet. You notice how few roads exist, how tall the grass grows, how quickly the horizon swallows the sun. It's not just geography, it's a warning. The land is whispering, and you get the feeling no one's listening. Still, the British press on. There are 3 columns in total. The central one under Lord Chelmsford, 2 others advancing from the north and south. They assume that the Zulus will scatter like frightened cattle, that the kingdom will crumble at the sight of artillery and neat marching lines, that empire always wins. They forget that the Zulu army trains to run 50 miles in a day barefoot, that warriors can move silently through tall grass like ghosts, that they've spent years preparing, not for conquest, but for exactly this kind of defense. You don't know it yet, but the hill called Insomnia is waiting. Quiet, still, like a coiled spring. And somewhere near the Royal Kraal, 20,000 warriors are sharpening spears and smiling in the dark. You wake before dawn, chilled and restless, surrounded by canvas tents flapping gently in the wind. Around you, the British encampment at Insomnia stirs with a sluggish confidence. Men yawn, rifles lean carelessly against supply wagons, and somewhere, an officer mumbles about the glorious day ahead. You try to shake the strange feeling pressing on your chest, something heavier than sleep, quieter than panic. The kind of unease that doesn't shout. It whispers. Insomnia is a curious hill, shaped like the curved spine of a lion crouching in tall grass. It watches. The British camp has nestled right below it, like a child falling asleep beneath a wolf's jaw. No entrenchments, no wagon laager, no defensive earthworks, just tents, livestock, and British bravado. Chelmsford, ever the optimist, has split his forces. Half have marched off at sunrise to chase what he believes is the main Zulu force spotted by scouts the night before. What he doesn't know, what you're about to find out, is that he's running away from 20,000 Zulu warriors, not toward them. Let that math simmer for a second. Left behind at the camp is a skeleton crew of about 1,700 soldiers. A mix of British regulars, colonial volunteers, and native auxiliaries. Many are green. Some are sick. Most are utterly unaware they're sitting in the center of a trap that has been tightening for weeks. Now here's the part they never taught you in school. The Zulu army was already there. Not marching, not arriving, waiting. You can almost feel them now, hidden in a donga, a dry gully just a mile away, where they've spent the night silent, motionless, wrapped in brown cowhide cloaks that blend perfectly with the earth. No torches, no fires, just breathing, listening. They know how the British fight. They've studied them, and they've decided to flip the script. The plan is a classic Zulu maneuver, the horns of the buffalo. It's not just a battlefield tactic, it's an art form. The chest, made of the strongest regiments, smashes through the center. The horns flank both sides, encircling. The loins wait in reserve, to plug gaps or chase stragglers. No radios, no horses, just rhythm, discipline, and ancestral fury. And now, the sun's climbing. You're mid-conversation with a corporal when the first gunshots ring out to the north. It's distant like thunder behind a closed door. Scouts are dispatched. Officers frown. Someone jokes that it's probably nothing. You've heard this tune before. What they don't realize is that the Zulus have already begun to move, rising from the earth like ghosts, 20,000 strong. They're barefoot, yes, but they are not unarmed. Their spears, ikawa, named for the sound it makes sliding into flesh, are sharp. Their shields, made of cowhide, wide enough to turn bullets at angles. And their coordination, flawless. Within minutes, the camp is in chaos. British soldiers scramble to form ranks. Ammunition boxes are locked, a fatal delay. The sun beats down as if trying to melt the very air. Officers bark contradictory orders. Some men fire too early. Others hold their shots too long. The Martini Henry rifles overheat. The Zulus keep coming. You don't hear war drums. You hear chanting, low and deep, the sound of men dancing into history. The chest hits first, absorbing bullets, but never stopping. Then the horns sweep wide, unnoticed until it's too late. They surround. This is not just a battle. It is a reckoning. And you, standing near the supply wagons, suddenly understand how quickly order becomes myth. By mid-afternoon, the British line buckles. Ammunition runs out, not for shortage, but from bad logistics. The riflemen are cut off from the reserve boxes. Soldiers try to break them open with bayonets. Some succeed. Most don't. One officer is seen fighting with his pistol until it jams. Another reportedly dies with his monocle still in. And just like that, the red line shatters. It's not a retreat. It's a rout. Men run, scream, trip over tent lines. Some dive into the rocks. Others are caught mid-stride by spears. Horses bolt. A few mounted troops escape across the Buffalo River. But even then, some are dragged from their saddles mid-crossing. And the Zulus? They do not gloat. They finish what they started, and then, just as silently as they came, they fade back into the hills. When Chelmsford returns that evening, he finds a field of bodies. Over 1,300 British and colonial troops are dead. Hundreds of native auxiliaries lie alongside them. British colors are gone. The camp is ransacked. Supplies torched. Only a handful survive to tell the tale. And now comes the strange, whispered detail you rarely hear. The Zulus bury the British dead. Not out of kindness, but respect. These were warriors. They died fighting. And in Zulu culture, that means something. The fallen are covered with stones, their bodies laid to rest as best as possible with the tools at hand. The British Empire, though, is not so philosophical. Back in London, panic. The press is horrified. Parliament clutches its pearls. Queen Victoria reportedly calls it a terrible disaster. How could a native army defeat trained British troops? Historians still argue whether Insomnia was due to arrogance, logistics, or sheer misfortune. Some blame Chelmsford for dividing his force. Others point to locked ammo boxes, poor intelligence, or the fatal underestimation of Zulu strategy. But you, standing among the wreckage, already know the answer. It was all of it, and none of it, because war, especially colonial war, is never as clean as the textbooks pretend. Here's a quirky side note. One of the few survivors was a dog, a regimental mascot named Pip, who outran both cavalry and chaos. The dog lived, and yes, he got a medal. Now, imagine the silence after the roar. You walk through the empty camp, the fires now smoldering, the hill of Insomnia looming like a silent judge. You wonder if the ground itself remembers each footstep, each scream. You wonder if Setchwayo, hearing news of the victory, felt triumph or dread. Because this war isn't over. It's just getting warmed up. And the British? They're not going to take this line down. You don't get much time to catch your breath. Because while Insomnia still smolders just 20 miles away, another storm is tightening its grip at a place so tiny it barely made the map. A remote mission station turned military post. You arrive there as the sun lowers behind the Drakensberg, its orange glow brushing a few shabby buildings, stacks of mail-eye bags, and a small hospital with more wounded than beds. Welcome to Rorke's Drift. You'd never guess that this sleepy cattle post, with its dusty yard and biscuit tin morale, is about to become the setting for one of the British Empire's most mythologized and misunderstood last stands. Here's the setup. While the bulk of the Zulu army is celebrating the staggering victory at Insomnia, a smaller impi of roughly 4,000 warriors peels off and marches toward the drift. Their goal? Disrupt the British supply lines and take out the field hospital. Nothing overly ambitious, just tactical cleanup. The defenders? Roughly 150 men, give or take. Most are members of the 24th Regiment of Foot. Others are engineers, sick patients, cooks. Hardly the dream team. And their commanding officers, Lieutenants John Chard and Gomble Bromhead, are, well, let's say they weren't exactly handpicked for glory. Chard is an engineer. Calm, methodical, unimpressive on paper. Bromhead is hard of hearing. Some say mostly deaf, and more accustomed to social dinners than battlefield commands. You glance at them from across the courtyard and wonder, how exactly is this going to work? It starts with noise. A runner arrives in the late afternoon, eyes wide and out of breath. He brings news from Isandlwana. Everyone's dead, he says, and the Zulus are coming here. That's when things start to click into motion. Chard and Bromhead, suddenly thrust into unwanted leadership, decide to hold their ground. Evacuation is considered, briefly, but it's dismissed. The hospital is full. The patients can't be moved. And so, you and the others begin stacking mail-eye bags, biscuit tins, and crates of ammo, building makeshift walls that form a tight perimeter between the hospital and storehouse. There's no time to think about survival odds. There's barely time to think at all. By late afternoon, the first Zulu scouts are spotted, darting like shadows across the horizon. The sun dips behind the hills, and then, like the moment before a storm breaks, the world goes utterly still. And then it starts. You feel it before you hear it. The ground vibrating under your boots, the rhythm of hundreds of feet running in unison. And then the ululation, high and fierce, a war cry that reaches into your spine and rearranges your courage. You grip your rifle tighter. You check your cartridges. You're not ready. No one is. The first wave slams into the barricades with breathtaking speed. The Zulus come in tight formation, some with muskets, most with spears. They test the walls, probing for weaknesses. Rifle fire erupts from the defenders, controlled at first, but quickly descending into chaos. Smoke curls into the twilight. Cries echo from the hospital. Somewhere to your left, a private yells that his rifle's jammed. And here's the twist. This time, it's not just about numbers. It's about angles, lines of fire, stamina, repetition. The Zulus launch assault after assault, each one probing, testing, pushing harder. But the defenders hold, not because they're superior, not because they're heroic, but because they're desperate, because the hospital is on fire and the wounded are trapped inside. And that's where it gets grim. You're helping pull patients through holes hacked into the hospital walls, literally dragging the injured from one room to the next, dodging flames, bullets, and spear thrusts as the roof collapses behind you. It's not a Hollywood moment. It's ugly. It's hot. It's chaos in slow motion. One of the most debated moments of the war happens right here. Historians still argue whether the Zulu forces intentionally avoided setting the hospital alight to preserve it for later use, or whether the blaze was accidental. What we do know is that the fire rages, the smoke blinds, and somehow most of the patients are hauled to safety. And still the Zulus come, wave after wave. There's a moment just before midnight when you're sure it's over. Ammunition is running low. Men are too tired to aim. Some are too tired to stand. You hear someone praying aloud, not eloquently, just muttering words like a stuck record. One of the Zulu warriors breaches the mail-eye bag wall and is shot point blank with a revolver. The man next to you vomits from exhaustion. And then, like a spell breaking, the tide slows. Around 4 a.m., the attacks taper off. Whether the Zulus are retreating or regrouping, no one knows. You sit with your back against a crate, face blackened with soot, arms trembling too hard to reload. Then the dawn. It rises over Rourke's Drift like a slow exhale. Lights sliding across the blood-stained yard, revealing the broken barricades, the burned-out hospital, the scattered bodies of Zulu warriors and British soldiers alike. A few Zulus linger on the hill, watching, and then, without ceremony, they melt back into the grasslands, as if they were never there. You survived. Somehow. The final tally, Over 600 Zulu warriors killed. 17 British defenders dead. The numbers alone don't tell the full story. But here's the twist. Rorke's drift, a tiny blip in a much larger catastrophe, becomes the story. Because back in Britain, the news of Insomnia hits like a thunderclap, and Rorke's drift becomes the bandage. The Empire needs a victory, no matter how small. Rorke's drift, with its dramatic last stand, its convenient heroics, and its photogenic survivors, becomes mythologized almost instantly. Medals rain from the sky. 11 Victoria Crosses, the most ever awarded for a single action. Chard and Bromhead are paraded like celebrities. Paintings are commissioned. Songs are written. Eventually, the movie Zulu will be made, starring Michael Caine with a truly confusing accent. And the real complexity, the fear, the brutality, the humanity of both sides will get papered over with convenient patriotism. But you were there. You saw the sweat, the terror, the desperation. You saw how close it came to collapse. And you wonder, quietly, why the bravery of the Zulu warriors that night never became part of the official tale. Why history prefers heroes in red coats over those in cowhide. A fringe account even claims that some Zulu warriors returned to Rorke's drift days later, not to fight, but to retrieve the bodies of fallen comrades for proper burial. No official records confirm it, but the land remembers. And so do you. You wake the next day to silence, the kind that rings louder than gunfire. There's no more smoke in the air, just the sour stench of blood and spent powder. Rorke's drift is still standing, technically, but intact might be a stretch. The walls are scorched, the mail-eye bag fortifications sag like deflated lungs, and the men, well, they stare a little too long, blink a little too slow. Survival, it turns out, doesn't come without consequences. You watch Chard and Bromhead attempt to tally the damage. Not just dead and wounded, but nerves, equipment, morale. A couple of the defenders still keep rifles within reach at all times, flinching when a bird rustles in the underbrush. It's understandable. Trauma doesn't care about medals. But while this tiny outpost licks its wounds, something darker brews in the Empire's veins. You see, back in London, news of the Anglo-Zulu War is arriving in fragmented telegrams and confused reports. First, there was Insomnia, a loss so unthinkable that Parliament members refused to believe it. Then, almost in the same breath, came the miracle of Rorke's drift. That's the version the public clutches onto. 11 Victoria Crosses handed out like party favors. Newspapers dubbed it a modern Thermopylae. Except Thermopylae didn't end with Queen Victoria's empire throwing a tantrum. Because here's what they don't tell you. The Battle of Rorke's Drift didn't inspire restraint. It triggered vengeance. Chelmsford, humiliated, grieving, and very much aware that his career now teetered on a knife's edge, needed a comeback. Fast. And he wasn't interested in nuanced strategies or clever diplomacy. No, the Empire would respond with exactly what it always did when its pride was bruised: overwhelming force. You sort of see it happen almost immediately. Supply trains begin crawling across the veldt. Reinforcements pour in, regiments from across Britain, colonial volunteers, mounted troops, artillery batteries. Telegraphs hum with plans and recriminations. The war machine begins grinding forward again, this time greased with imperial outrage. Historians still argue whether Chelmsford had any real choice. Some say he was backed into a corner by public pressure and government scrutiny. Others suggest he actively manipulated events to erase his earlier failures. Either way, you can feel the mood shift. This is no longer a campaign to secure the border. This is a full-fledged act of retribution. You travel with Chelmsford's regrouped forces, now swollen with fresh soldiers and a disturbing amount of new uniforms, as though dying in one's old clothes had been the real issue at Insomnia. The first thing you notice? The rules have changed. Where once the British moved cautiously, now they march with grim purpose. Forts are erected along their route, not just for defense, but as psychological markers, stakes driven into Zulu soil to say, we're not going anywhere. And in this wave of imperial fury, you start to see some strange and often forgotten faces. Take Colonel Redvers Buller, for instance. He arrives with a reputation that teeters between brilliant and bizarre. He rides fast, talks faster, and seems to believe that the Zulu warriors might respect him if he just stares at them hard enough. Later, he'll go on to be a rather controversial figure in the Boer War. But here, in Zululand, he's still being myth-shaped. Or look at the native contingent. African soldiers conscripted by the British, often forced to fight their Zulu kin. They're poorly armed, underpaid, and often treated like baggage with legs. Yet, many of them stand their ground in firefights where better-armed European troops waver. That's the part you never read in textbooks. And then there's the looting. You see it firsthand. Burned homesteads, uprooted kraals, fields torched just to deny food to the Zulu people. Entire villages cleared out, their inhabitants labeled hostile simply for existing in proximity to British patrols. The Zulu civilians, mostly women, children, and elderly, start fleeing into the hills. You catch glimpses of them from your perch on a supply cart. A mother clutching a baby, her eyes wide with questions you'll never be able to answer. Here's the awkward truth buried beneath the medals and marching bands. The British campaign, from this point forward, isn't about justice. It's about punishment. Even some officers murmur uneasily about it over 10 mugs of coffee at night. Not cricket, one says under his breath. Not how we're meant to do things. But the machine doesn't stop. One of the oddest rumors you hear during this phase is about the use of psychological warfare. Some British troops reportedly leave decapitated Zulu bodies displayed on posts. Not a sanctioned tactic. Mind you, just individual cruelties excused under the fog of war. Other times, they dig trenches so deep for latrines that officers joke about burying the memory of Isanolana. And as you ride further into the heart of Zululand, you notice the land itself seems to recoil. The hills feel quieter, the rivers a little slower, the animals more cautious. You wonder if the earth knows what's coming. Because make no mistake, the British aren't just rebuilding their forces. They're sharpening them. New orders roll in. This time, they'll fortify their camps, form wagon loggers, keep ammunition within arm's reach. Chelmsford revises his entire tactical doctrine, not out of genius, but necessity. He finally realizes the Zulus aren't savages. They're intelligent, adaptive, and deeply motivated defenders of their homeland. Historians sometimes call this the second invasion phase, but that makes it sound clean and strategic. It's more like a slow, angry crawl. You find yourself sleeping in half-dug trenches, listening to officers argue about weather patterns and troop placements. Every sunrise is an omen. Every hill might hide an impi. And here's your fringe fact for the night. Among the baggage train of this advancing army is a small, traveling artist. A sketcher named Melton Pryor. He's technically a war correspondent, but you catch him drawing everything from marching columns to half-naked scouts to injured horses. He's documenting the war, not in numbers, but in charcoal and ink. His images will go on to shape public opinion back in England far more powerfully than any dry casualty report. You wonder what he'd sketch if he looked at you. And as the days stretch into weeks and the miles into blurred monotony, you realize something chilling. This isn't about who's right anymore. It's about who's left. And if Chelmsford has his way, it won't be many Zulus. It's early morning when the mist curls over the valley like an old memory, thick and reluctant to rise. You're standing on the lip of the Ntum River, boots half sunk in dewy grass, watching as another British patrol prepares to cross. They seem confident, too confident, and that's your first warning. The Ntum Drift has been overlooked by many accounts of the Anglo-Zulu War, mostly because it didn't come with medals or Michael Caine impersonations. But you're here now, and you'll see why this little skirmish, with barely 100 men and a couple of wagons, should never have been forgotten. Captain David Moriarty is in charge today. You know the type? Amiable, experienced, a bit too relaxed for what's unfolding. He's setting up a camp on one bank of the river, but his command is stretched thin. Instead of one solid logger, he has split his forces into two, half on either side of the river. Logistics, he says, simpler to manage the wagons that way. But as the sun lifts, you feel a tension in the air, like the land holding its breath. You're not wrong. Unbeknownst to Moriarty, or perhaps underestimated by him, a Zulu impi of over 800 warriors, led by Mbeleni Wamswati, is watching from the hills. Mbeleni is no ordinary war leader. He's Swazi royalty, technically exiled, and very much nursing a personal grudge against colonial authority. With sharp eyes and a sharper brain, he studies the British positioning and sees what you now see too, a deliciously vulnerable setup. The attack comes just before dawn. You're still rubbing the sleep from your eyes when the first Zulu spears glint in the mist. No horns of the buffalo maneuver this time, just a headlong charge straight at the camp on the far bank. Moriarty, half-dressed, grabs his revolver and bellows for order. But it's already too late. You scramble for cover, but it's chaos. The wagons are bottlenecks. The laager is half-formed. Ammunition is scattered, and soldiers trip over tent ropes in their haste to form firing lines. A bugler tries to sound the alarm and is cut down mid-note. It's a massacre in slow motion. Moriarty himself is among the first to fall, shot in the chest, then speared before he hits the ground. The camp collapses inward, soldiers desperately trying to cross back over the river to safety, some stripped of gear, others not even wearing boots. The tomb itself becomes a scene of horror, its waters turning a pale pink as the wounded tumble in, trying to escape. In total, over 60 British soldiers are killed in the span of a few frenzied minutes. And the weird part? This was supposed to be a supply patrol, just a casual river crossing. But now it's another bloody warning. The Zulu are not done yet. Not even close. What makes this incident sting, beyond the dead, is its sheer preventability. Historians still argue whether Moriarty received adequate intelligence before setting camp, or whether the warning signs were simply ignored. There's debate over whether his superior officers underestimated Mbeleni's position. One thing's certain, it fits the ongoing pattern of imperial arrogance meeting native strategy and losing. But it's not all despair. On the far side of the river, a young lieutenant named Harward watches the battle unfold. And here's where things get messy. Seeing the Zulu attack, he allegedly panics, abandons the wounded, and flees with some mounted men, leaving the foot soldiers behind. This moment sparks one of the war's lesser-known scandals. Harward is later court-martialed for desertion. The trial becomes a media curiosity. Was he a coward or simply pragmatic? The court eventually acquits him, but the whispers never die. You hear a couple of old soldiers mutter about it one night by a fire. You don't run unless the devil's got your ankles. And so, Ntom is written off as a minor skirmish, a footnote, but not to you, because you saw the fear in those men's eyes. You saw what happened when experience couldn't outpace underestimation. You saw how a river, just a trickle of water, could turn into a grave when arrogance tried to ford it. There's another strange detail you notice before leaving the valley. A few Zulu warriors come back after the fight, not to gloat, but to gather their own. They move silently, solemnly. They retrieve the fallen with a kind of reverence you didn't expect. No celebration, just ritual. And that's when you realize something the textbooks rarely tell. For all the empire's drums and bugles, it's the Zulus who seem to understand the weight of blood. The British soon sweep in to secure the area, but it's mostly cleanup. There's no great counterattack, no sudden reversal. Just bodies, broken wagons, and soldiers too shocked to speak. Even among the officers, the mood is shifting. You hear one, a sharp-eyed major with a worn notebook, mumble, "Every time we think we've seen the worst of it." But you haven't. Ntom is just the beginning of a ripple effect. a signpost on a downward slope. And as you ride away from the river's edge, ears still ringing with the screams of men who'd only meant to deliver flour and bullets, you find yourself glancing at every rise, every shadow. The landscape no longer feels like terrain. It feels like a warning. You don't get to rest much after dawn. Just days later, the smell of gunpowder still in your nostrils, you're pushed onward, deeper into a land that no longer even pretends to tolerate your presence. You find yourself approaching a place called Hlobane Mountain, a jagged fortress of rock and thorns jutting out of the landscape like the knuckles of a buried giant. It's breathtaking from a distance, and a death trap up close. The British plan is audacious. Launch a surprise assault on Zulu strongholds built into the crags of this mountain. It's meant to punish Mbeleni wa Mswati, the same clever commander who orchestrated the bloodbath at Ntom. And who better to lead the charge than Colonel Evelyn Wood? Brilliant, ambitious, and always 2 degrees from a nervous breakdown. Which troops are exhausted, supplies are patchy, and intelligence on enemy numbers is fuzzy at best. But none of that stops the plan. Not when Chelmsford's entire campaign now hinges on proving British dominance. The message is clear. No more delays, no more disasters. So here you are again, marching with the vanguard before sunrise on March 28th, 1879. You scramble up steep slopes in near silence. Every rock a potential ambush, every rustling leaf a phantom spear. The attack begins with promise. Zulu scouts are caught off guard, and Wood's men manage to take some elevated positions. But doesn't last. As dawn breaks and the sun stretches across the ridgeline, things begin to unravel. You realize with creeping horror that the main Zulu army, yes, the real one, isn't far off. In fact, they're on the move. 1,000 strong, closing in fast from the southeast. Wood's intelligence was wrong. Again, the tiny British assault team, perched atop this rocky island in the sky, is about to be swallowed. There's no elegant military maneuver now, just a brutal scramble to survive. The terrain becomes your enemy. Loose boulders shift underfoot. Horses balk at ledges. Gunfire echoes wildly, ricocheting off stone walls and confusing friend from foe. A mounted trooper is tossed from his horse and falls 40 feet, landing with a sound you never forget. You help another soldier who slipped and dislocated his shoulder. He tries to crawl, but the pain is too much. You don't get to help him twice. And as chaos erupts, the decision is made. Retreat. But the only way down? The Devil's Pass. That's not a metaphor. It's a narrow cleft cut into the cliffside, barely wide enough for one man at a time. It's flanked by sheer drops and crawling with loose shale. And now, it's the only escape route for hundreds of panicking men. You descend with them, heart hammering against your ribs like it wants to jump out and run ahead. Around you, horses slip and scream, men tumble, rifles clatter into the abyss. It's not a retreat. It's a controlled collapse. Some Zulus, ever the patient hunters, shadow the descent from the flanks, picking off stragglers with chilling precision. And then you hear it, the war chant, not from above but behind. The main Zulu force has arrived and now pours over the summit like black ink down a canvas. Their ululations roll across the valley, thrumming, rhythmic, somehow both beautiful and terrifying. It hits your bones. The line between poetry and horror blurs. Evelyn Wood barely escapes with his life, thanks in part to a daring rearguard action led by one of his young officers, Redvers Buller again. Remember him? He charges back up the path, plucking stranded men onto his saddle like a heroic pack mule. He'll win the Victoria Cross for this, though even he later mutters that medals don't make the nightmares go away. The British lose over 300 men. 300. But because they technically withdrew in order and saved a handful of wounded, the engagement is called a strategic failure instead of a disaster. You know better. Still, they cling to one silver lining. The attack was meant to rattle the Zulus before a larger engagement. And oh boy, does that engagement come. Because the very next day, at Cambula, a fortified British camp nearby, the Zulu impis come thundering in, high off their victory at Hlobane and hungry to finish what they started. You're already there when it begins. Cambula is different. The British, still reeling from their mistakes, have fortified this place properly. Wagon lager? Check. Ammunition within reach? Check. Artillery zeroed and on approach routes? Triple check. This time, you feel it. Not panic. Not arrogance. Readiness. The Zulu charge comes in waves, disciplined, fearless, relentless. Thousands of warriors fan out in formation. Their advance, somehow, both ancient and calculated. They're met with precise British firepower. Volley after volley, shells shredding the front ranks. The air turns thick with smoke and iron and something else, resolve. You're manning a corner of the lager wall when a group of Zulu fighters breaches a cattle kraal nearby. For a moment, it seems they'll crack the defenses, but a bayonet countercharge pushes them back. It's brutal, messy, up close. No time for grand tactics, just raw instinct and quick feet. At one point, a British officer slips on blood-slicked ground, loses his sword, and fends off a Zulu spear with a garden shovel he grabbed from a trench line. Later, over whiskey, he'll pretend it was all deliberate. And here's your odd tidbit of the day. During the battle, one British soldier, possibly concussed, reportedly sang a bawdy music hall tune from London while reloading his rifle. It made no sense. No one joined in. But the absurdity of it gave 3 men nearby just enough courage to hold their position a few seconds longer. By sunset, the Zulu retreat. This time, it's a clear British victory. The defenders hold the line. The casualty numbers are sobering. Over 800 Zulu dead. British losses? Around 80. The Empire wastes no time declaring Cambula a turning point. Newspapers call it redemption. Chelmsford breathes easier. Even Queen Victoria reportedly sends a letter of commendation. But you don't celebrate, because you saw what it took. You saw the price of survival. And more importantly, you saw that the war, this war, isn't close to over. Not for the Zulu warriors now regrouping under King Setsweo's tattered authority. Not for the villages left smoldering behind every retreat. And certainly not for the African scouts, the mule drivers, the water carriers, nameless to history, who keep dying just outside the frame. Historians still debate whether Cambula was the beginning of the end or merely the end of the beginning. Some argue it shattered Zulu morale. Others say it only hardened their resolve. You're starting to suspect that in this war, victories don't feel like triumphs. They feel like delays. You're moving again, always moving. The smell of scorched earth clings to your boots now, and your hands still twitch when you hear a bird cry too close. After Cambula, there's a pause, a strange stillness. No one says it out loud, but everyone knows what's coming next. The reckoning. Lord Chelmsford, with his reputation hanging by a thread, is planning his second invasion. Round 2. This time it has to work. It must work. The Queen, the Parliament, the newspapers, they're all watching. So, naturally, he overcompensates. You now find yourself embedded in the largest British field force ever assembled in southern Africa up to that point. Nearly 25,000 men. That's redcoats, colonial volunteers, native auxiliaries, oxen, mules, and enough wagons to start a small shipping empire. It's a walking fortress of firepower stretching for miles. Chelmsford has learned, sort of. He reinforces his supply lines, tightens marching formations, and triples his pickets at night. But the scars of Isinlwana still linger. Every officer checks the hills twice. Every soldier reloads before sleep. You reach the borderlands again in early June 1879. The landscape is changing. The fields look emptier. Villages are abandoned. The Zulu are still watching, but now from farther away. Shadowy presences behind tree lines and ridges. King Setsweo, pressed hard from all sides, has shifted his strategy. No more large-scale clashes, no more open charges. He's bleeding his people slow, choosing when and where to sting. This new British advance cuts a wide path toward Ulundi, the royal capital. Chelmsford wants to end the war with a single, glorious blow. The idea is simple. Destroy the king's kraal, cripple his government, and force a surrender. But here's what they didn't tell you. While Chelmsford's army lumbers toward Ulundi like an ironclad whale, Cetewayo is doing something few colonial commanders expected. He's reaching out for peace. That's right. The warrior king, painted in history as the relentless enemy of empire, is secretly sending envoys. Letters. Messages of negotiation. He doesn't want this war anymore. He never did. Historians still argue whether these peace overtures were genuine attempts to end hostilities or calculated stalling tactics. Either way, Chelmsford doesn't bite. Not really. He listens. He nods. He delays. But he presses forward. Because here's the dirty secret. Chelmsford needs a victory. Not just to win the war, but to save himself. Remember that telegram that went out after Insomnia? The one that shredded his career in the British press? He's been answering for that ever since. If he retreats now, even in the name of peace, he's done. So peace becomes inconvenient. You pass the ruins of old Zulu settlements. Some are still smoldering, the air heavy with the scent of charred thatch and split wood. Others are long deserted, looted, and lifeless. It's not just Zulu warriors who have suffered. It's families, elders, children. One morning, you see a group of colonial troops kick over calabash pots and laugh, pretending they're footballs. You don't laugh with them. One of the more surreal moments comes when you cross the White Mfolozi River. It's quiet. Too quiet. A small, ceremonial Zulu group watches from the far bank. No weapons, just traditional dress. One of them calls something to your side in Anglo-Zulu, and an African scout beside you translates. He says, "You walk like thunder, but you don't know the storm." You don't respond. How could you? Your unit continues its march. Every few days, you skirmish with retreating warriors or burn a homestead. It feels less like war and more like slow-motion destruction. Attrition by bureaucracy. And then there's the thing no one mentions officially, but whispers about constantly, the bounty system. Some colonial units, particularly irregulars, are incentivized not just by salary, but by trophies, as in physical proof of enemy kills. Some rumors say it's ears. Others say it's more gruesome. Chelmsford's command officially forbids it, but enforcement is inconsistent at best. You overhear a young lieutenant bragging about how many trophies he's claimed, and the older sergeant next to him goes pale. Doesn't speak for the rest of the night. The madness is spreading. By mid-June, the second invasion force is fully entrenched deep within Zululand. The roads behind you are lined with outposts and field hospitals. Supplies flow in like blood through arteries. The final assault is near, but something still doesn't feel right. Cetewayo, for all his desperation, hasn't vanished. In fact, there are signs that he's planning something final. Not a grand defense of Ulundi, but a last-ditch stand on ground of his choosing. You hear whispers of an army gathering near the capital, dispersed, mobile, and still burning with resolve. Chelmsford chooses his battle site carefully. He'll march into a wide plain near the royal kraal, laager his wagons, and face the Zulu in a controlled engagement. He calls it modern warfare. You call an invitation. And there's a final twist no one saw coming. While Chelmsford prepares for the showdown at Ulundi, a second British column, this one under Sir Garnet Wolseley, Chelmsford's replacement, is sailing into Natal. That's right. The general is being relieved of command before his war is even finished. If Chelmsford loses at Ulundi, it will be the last note of his career. But if he wins, well, history is written by the survivors, isn't it? On the eve of the final march, you sit by the fire with men who've been through every horror since Insomnia. Some are polishing bayonets. Some are writing shaky letters home. One is praying not to win, but to survive. A nearby officer, grizzled, red-eyed, and chewing a sprig of fever bark, says something that stays with you. Tomorrow, we either break the Zulu or break ourselves trying. You don't sleep that night. The plains outside are too still. The stars too bright. You wonder if the ancestors are watching and whose side they'll take. Dawn slides across the plains like spilled milk, soft and deceptively calm. You're awake before the sun, boots already laced, rifle cleaned, senses buzzing in a way no coffee could replicate. This is it, the final act. The field before you, wide, flat, and featureless, looks like it's been designed by fate to host a decisive battle. It's July 4th, 1879, Independence Day in America. But here in Zululand, it's the day the British Empire rolls the dice. The field is called Ulundi. Chelmsford's army moves into position with machine-like precision. It's a staggering sight. Over 4,000 men, including cavalry, artillery, and infantry, forming a massive, square-shaped laager in the open plain. Wagons circle the perimeter, cannons are mounted at the corners, and Gatling guns hum with promise. You're stationed on the north side, where the grass is a little taller and the breeze smells faintly of smoke and blood. The sun climbs, the dust settles, and the silence tightens. And then they come. Thousands upon thousands of Zulu warriors crest the hills in a coordinated wave, each one clad in traditional gear, shields held high, spears poised for that final, desperate thrust. They advance in the infamous buffalo horn formation, the chest in the center, the horns to envelop, and the loins in reserve. It's a tactic older than the Empire, but still terrifyingly effective. You don't have time to admire the choreography. The rifles open up before they're within 100 yards. Volley after volley. The Gatling guns chatter like angry typewriters, stitching death across the plain. Cannonballs land in the middle of tight formations, sending dust and limbs into the air. The Zulus keep coming. And this time, you notice something: no screaming. No battle cries. Just the dull roar of thousands of feet pounding the earth. The drumbeat of determination. It's as if they've accepted death already and are sprinting toward it not to survive, but to mean something. Chelmsford paces inside the square, cloak flapping, saber unsheathed. This is the performance of a lifetime. You can almost hear him thinking, let the world see this. Let history remember. The Zulu breach the edge of the square at one point. For few heartbeats, it feels like Isanwana all over again. A young British soldier to your left panics, drops his rifle, and tries to run. He makes about 10 steps before a senior officer tackles him, shouting, "Inside the square or not at all." Not the most motivational slogan, but it works. Some of the Zulu warriors make it past the outer ring. Hand-to-hand combat erupts. Bayonets meet spears, shouts mix with gurgles. You end up firing point blank into a man whose eyes meet yours just before the shot. He doesn't scream. He just falls. Then the tide turns. The Gatling guns find their rhythm. The artillery locks in. And for the first time, the Zulu lines begin to break. Not panic, but erosion. They peel away from the flanks, falling back in clusters. The center buckles. The horns retract. The loins never even engage. They retreat. You can't believe it. After all this, after months of horror and heat and humiliation, the Zulus are withdrawing. But Chelmsford isn't done. He orders the cavalry to pursue. You hear the bugles sound, and suddenly horsemen pour from the square like water through a sluice gate. They chase the retreating Zulu for miles, cutting down as many as they can reach. It's not a battle anymore. It's a massacre. One officer later claims it felt like fox hunting, only the foxes were men with families, songs, and dreams. Another describes it more bluntly. I saw the empire unclothe its civility. You stay behind with the square, watching the smoke settle. The battlefield is a horror painting. Hundreds of Zulu bodies lie twisted in poses that defy anatomy. Some still clutch their shields, Others are frozen mid-step. A few British soldiers walk among them, looking for wounded comrades, and yes, for trophies. You hear a loud argument when a trooper tries to claim a shield still clutched by a barely breathing man. Eventually, an officer intervenes. The shield is left. The man dies anyway. That's how victory tastes. You move with the rest of the army to Ulundi itself, a once mighty kraal, now eerily silent. The royal huts are burned. Livestock scatter. The great Isagadlo, where royal women once sang under moonlight, is ash and rubble. No ceremony, no surrender, just smoke. And here's your quirky little fact for the day. Chelmsford, ever the dramatist, reportedly lit his cigar off the burning timbers of the king's palace. An officer wrote it down like it was a triumph. You just shake your head. That night, the British soldiers sing songs around the fire. Some drink too much. Some cry. One young drummer boy recites Shakespeare, mangling the lines, but somehow still making them beautiful. Once more unto the breach, he says, and the men around him laugh. Not at him, but with him, because they need to believe it was noble. That any of this was noble. But the truth hangs heavy. Ulundi is the end of the war in every way that matters. The Zulu military is broken. King Cetshwayo flees into the bush, later to be captured and exiled to Cape Town. The once mighty Zulu kingdom is fractured, divided into chieftaincies ruled by British appointees, each one less legitimate than the last. Historians still debate whether the destruction of Ulundi was a necessary military conclusion or a performative overreach designed to erase Zulu power altogether. Some argue that Chelmsford's victory paved the way for peace. Others call it the moment the empire traded civilization for supremacy. You just keep seeing the eyes of that warrior who fell at your feet. In the days that follow, the British press explodes with praise. Chelmsford is saved barely. He returns to England with a knighthood, though his star never rises again. Redvers Buller becomes a hero. The rank and file go home, or to other wars. There's always another one waiting. And you? You leave Ulundi with your boots soaked, your uniform tattered, and your soul just a little quieter. You've survived the disaster, but something inside you stayed behind. Maybe it's better that way. The aftermath unfolds like the slow peeling of scab, painful, revealing, and not nearly as neat as the newspapers want you to believe. You're still in Zululand, but the war is over. At least officially. The British flag waves over Ulundi's ruins and redcoats patrol the land. But the air feels heavy with uncertainty, like a storm waiting to break. The British have won the battle, but have they won the peace? That's the question no one quite wants to answer out loud. The Zulu, for all their defeat, remains stubbornly present in every village, every ridge, every whisper of wind through the tall grass. They are not gone. They are not broken. Instead, what you witness next is something almost as tragic as the war itself, the dismantling of a kingdom. Cetshwayo, once the proud king who stood against the empire, is captured and sent into exile, first in Cape Town, then later to London, where he's paraded like an exotic curiosity. You hear he meets Queen Victoria herself, but no one talks much about what was said. You imagine it was a conversation soaked in polite silences and the cold air of colonial arrogance. Back in Zululand, the British divide the territory into 13 smaller chiefdoms, each ruled by chiefs loyal to the crown, or at least those willing to cooperate. The old social order, the deep-rooted system of governance, is ripped apart and replaced with a patchwork of puppet rulers and tribal rivals. You see the consequences immediately. Neighbor turns against neighbor. Old allies become enemies. The land, once united by tradition and culture, fractures into competing fiefdoms. There are rumors of banditry, of hunger, and of endless skirmishes. The British authorities try to maintain control, but the infrastructure is weak. Roads remain treacherous. Supplies are scarce. Disease spreads like wildfire, fueled by malnutrition and displacement. You watch a group of Zulu women tending to wounded children in a makeshift camp. Their faces are tired, their hands calloused, but there's a fierce pride that refuses to be extinguished. One woman hums a haunting song, a melody that seems to carry the weight of centuries. Meanwhile, Chelmsford fades into obscurity. His knighthood doesn't bring him joy. Instead, he's haunted by the ghosts of Isandlwana and Ulundi. His military career stalls, and he spends his remaining years defending his reputation in a series of bitter pamphlets and court cases. Here's a quirky fact for you. Despite the defeat, some British soldiers secretly admired the Zulus' discipline and courage so much that they smuggled home souvenirs like assegais, spears, and cowhide shields. These objects ended up in Victorian parlors, displayed as trophies, but also as exotic reminders of a war that challenged the empire's self-image. Historians still debate whether the British dismantling of the Zulu state was a necessary evil to prevent further conflict or an act of cultural genocide driven by imperial greed. Either way, the scars of this period run deep, shaping South Africa's turbulent history for generations. You realize that while the battlefields may grow quiet, the war's echoes will persist in memories, in stories, and in the shifting sands of power. You gather your gear one last time, preparing to leave Zululand behind. The sun dips low, casting long shadows across the veldt. You pause, taking a deep breath of the warm, dry air, knowing that this land and its people will never truly be conquered. Because some fires, no matter how fiercely they're stamped out, keep burning beneath the surface. You leave Zululand behind, but the story doesn't end there. As your transport rattles over the rugged roads toward the coast, you're thinking about how the Anglo-Zulu War rippled far beyond those scorched plains. What you probably weren't told is just how much this conflict echoed in the shifting politics of the British Empire and the wider world. Back in London, the British public devours every scrap of news. Newspapers paint the war like a dramatic soap opera, full of heroic last stands, bungled commands, and savage foes. But they gloss over the messy realities, the political infighting, the racial attitudes, the colonial greed. You're left wondering who is really the villain, who the hero, and whether such lines even make sense. Chelmsford's role is debated hotly in Parliament. Some call him a scapegoat for poor planning. Others hail his ultimate victory at Ulundi as a triumph of British resolve. Yet, the fact remains that this war exposed serious weaknesses in the British military machine. The defeat at Isandlwana sent shockwaves through the empire, forcing reforms that shaped future colonial campaigns. You learn about a curious footnote. The war's outcome influenced British policy in neighboring territories like Basutoland, modern Lesotho, and the Transvaal. The empire's officials grew wary of underestimating indigenous forces, recalibrating their strategies in ways that still influenced South African geopolitics for decades. Meanwhile, the Zulu people, displaced and divided, found new ways to resist and adapt. Cetshwayo's exile, for example, did not extinguish his influence. He was eventually allowed to return to Zululand under strict British supervision, a symbolic gesture that barely masked the kingdom's loss of sovereignty. Some Zulu leaders, meanwhile, worked within the new colonial system, trying to preserve what they could of their culture and autonomy. You hear about the creation of mission schools, new Christian converts, and the slow, but persistent, melding of traditions. You start to grasp a broader lesson. The Anglo-Zulu War was not just a clash of armies, but a collision of worlds and worldviews. The British Empire, with its industrial age technologies and Victorian ideals, versus the ancient rhythms and fierce independence of the Zulu nation. Here's an odd little fact to ponder. Some British soldiers reported being struck by the Zulus' spirituality and rituals, which seemed to give them strength and unity even in defeat. Certain officers speculated that the Zulus' belief in ancestral spirits and the supernatural helped forge a collective well, that no amount of artillery could easily break. Historians still debate how much these cultural factors influenced the war's course. Was it sheer military prowess, or something deeper, a spiritual resilience, that made the Zulu such formidable opponents? You think back to the quiet moments, the songs by the fires, the solemn faces of warriors, and realize that war is never just about guns and strategy. It's about people, their fears, their hopes, their stories. As your carriage bumps along, you wonder what lessons the Empire really learned from Zululand. Was it wisdom? Or just a reminder that even the mightiest powers can stumble when they underestimate the human spirit? You step back into the world beyond Zululand, but the aftershocks of the Anglo-Zulu War continue rippling through your mind like a slow drumbeat that refuses to fade. The war may have officially ended with the British flag raised over Lundy's ashes, but the story, much like the tangled grasses of the veldt, twists and turns beyond any neat conclusion. In fact, the conflict planted seeds that grew into political turmoil, cultural clashes, and social upheavals that shaped southern Africa for decades, and which historians still unpack with varying theories today. Your journey now takes you across South Africa's shifting political landscape in the early 1880s, a place as volatile and unpredictable as the African sky before a thunderstorm. The Anglo-Zulu War was not an isolated event, but a chapter in a much larger saga of colonial expansion, indigenous resistance, and the collision of empires. The first thing you notice is how the British administration attempts to impose order on the fractured Zulu kingdom. You hear about how the British High Commissioner, Sir Henry Bartle Frere, orchestrated a strategy of divide and rule, carving Zululand into a patchwork of 13 chiefdoms, each led by rival leaders chosen or approved by colonial authorities. The intent? To dismantle the centralized power structure that once allowed the Zulu to unite under King Cetshwayo. But this bureaucratic map-making did not create peace. It sowed chaos. You find yourself wandering through villages where once united clans now face each other across invisible battle lines. Old friendships and loyalties fracture like brittle bones. You hear whispers of armed skirmishes between rival chiefs, fueled by resentments stoked by British meddling. The land, once the stage of a grand, if tragic, war, has become a simmering cauldron of factionalism. There's a certain irony here. The British came claiming to bring civilization and order, but what they left behind was a fractured society struggling to pick up the pieces. The war that was supposed to be quick and decisive turned into a slow-burning saga of instability. Meanwhile, Cetshwayo's story continues in exile. You follow the trail of the king from Zululand to Cape Town, then to London. His presence in the imperial capital is like a ghost from a world the British thought they'd conquered. Crowds gather out of curiosity, some with pity, others with disdain, but all intrigued by the man who once stood toe-to-toe with an empire. Despite his dethronement, Cetshwayo remains a symbol, a reminder that the Zulu nation is far from defeated in spirit. Eventually, political pressure and public sympathy compelled the British to allow Cetshwayo to return to Zululand in 1883, but under strict limitations. He's no longer a king, but more of a pensioned noble, a shadow of his former self. You sit with local storytellers who recount the king's return as bittersweet. The land is changed. The power structures are different. The people's hearts are heavy. Cetshwayo dies not long after, his legacy trapped between reverence and loss. Your mind drifts to the young Zulu warriors who once charged the British squares at Isandlwana and Ulundi. Some of them survived, returning to villages where colonial authorities watched them like hawks. Others were absorbed into labor forces, sent to work in mines or farms under harsh conditions that barely differ from slavery. The war's end did not free them. It transformed their chains. Here's a quirky, almost surreal detail you come across. Some British officers, fascinated by the Zulus' battlefield tactics, secretly studied and even incorporated aspects of their fighting style into military training manuals. They marveled at the buffalo horn formation's elegance and effectiveness, admitting, at least in private correspondence, that they had been caught off guard more than once. Historians still debate how much of the Zulu military prowess was tactical genius versus sheer bravery. Some argue that the British underestimated the depth of indigenous strategic thinking, blinded by colonial arrogance. Others suggest that the technological gap, the British rifles and artillery versus the Zulu assegai, ultimately decided the war's outcome. But the human story beneath these debates is what sticks with you. You hear from survivors who speak not only of battle, but of displacement, of losing their homes, of children who grew up knowing only a fractured land. You learn about the rise of missionary schools, where some Zulu youth received a Western education, a double-edged sword promising opportunity, but also cultural erasure. In the growing towns and cities of Natal and the Cape Colony, you witness a new social order forming, one where race and class intersect in complex, often brutal ways. The war may have ended, but colonialism's grip tightens. Policies favor white settlers and marginalize indigenous peoples, sowing seeds for the apartheid system that will emerge decades later. Amid this shifting world, you reflect on the cultural memory of the Anglo-Zulu War. In Britain, it's largely remembered as a footnote, a lesson in colonial hubris, a military embarrassment, then a triumphant recovery. But in Zulu oral histories, the war lives on as a story of courage, loss, and resistance. You listen as elders recount tales of warriors who fought not just with spears and shields, but with the spirit of their ancestors behind them. The songs and dances born from this era continue to echo through generations, keeping alive a heritage the empire tried to erase. And yet, you're struck by how little the outside world truly understands about this chapter of history. The textbooks, the films, the grand narratives often miss the nuanced realities. The everyday lives disrupted, the cultures challenged, the resilience forged in the crucible of conflict. You think about the lessons for today. How often do empires repeat their mistakes, blinded by arrogance and a hunger for control? How frequently are indigenous voices silenced in histories told by conquerors? And how essential is it to listen, really listen, to those stories before the next chapter unfolds? The sun sets over the African horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and violet. You take a deep breath, feeling the vastness of the land beneath the endless sky, the weight of history pressing gently on your shoulders. There is no simple victory here, no clear end, just the continuing story of a people, a place, and a world forever changed by the clash that was the Anglo-Zulu War. You're still riding the wave of history's echoes when the long shadows of the Anglo-Zulu War begin to stretch beyond southern Africa and into the wider British Empire and global consciousness. The conflict, with its dramatic clashes and vivid stories of courage and calamity, had an impact that few expected, and it reshaped how colonial powers viewed indigenous resistance everywhere. Let's zoom out for a moment, because the Anglo-Zulu War was not just about Zululand and the British Empire's ambition there. No, it was a microcosm of a larger, more tangled struggle playing out across the 19th century world. The British Empire, stretched across continents, was simultaneously fighting to hold its territories, assimilate or subjugate native populations, and manage growing tensions back home and abroad. When news of the defeat at Insomnia reached London, it shook the empire to its core. Imagine the sensation. Thousands of British soldiers wiped out by a force they considered primitive. It wasn't just a military setback. It was a blow to the Victorian myth of imperial invincibility. The British public was stunned, and the press seized on every sensational detail. You can almost hear the gasps in the crowded coffee houses, the scribbling of frantic newspaper editors, the hushed conversations in drawing rooms where empire builders nursed their wounded pride. Some newspapers even ran exaggerated stories about savages and barbarians, as if that helped explain away the humiliation. But beneath the bluster lay a gnawing fear. What if the British Empire was not as unstoppable as it seemed? This shockwave's effect rippled to other colonies, from India to Australia and beyond. Colonial governors and military leaders took note, revising their strategies and doctrines. They began paying closer attention to local customs, terrains, and the fighting methods of indigenous peoples. The idea of civilized superiority began to face uncomfortable scrutiny. You find evidence of this shift in military manuals from the late 1880s, where new tactics emphasize adaptability and intelligence gathering. Some British officers started advocating for training in guerrilla warfare and the use of native scouts, something previously dismissed as unnecessary. It's a subtle but important change, a tacit acknowledgement that the old ways weren't enough. Here's a quirky aside. Some British soldiers who served in the Anglo-Zulu War later became fascinated collectors of African art and artifacts. They brought back assegais, shields, and beadwork, not just as trophies but as symbols of respect for a culture they had underestimated. Victorian society, while often patronizing, sometimes exhibited a strange fascination with the exotic aspects of its colonies. You can almost picture a London parlor filled with African curiosities next to Victorian tea sets. Back in South Africa, the war's conclusion marked the beginning of a slow, creeping transformation in how colonial authorities managed their territories. The British started promoting settler agriculture and mining operations, seeing economic exploitation as a means of consolidating control. The influx of European settlers intensified conflicts with indigenous peoples, whose lands were increasingly encroached upon. This economic shift laid groundwork for the racial segregation policies that would later crystallize into apartheid. The Anglo-Zulu War may have been a military episode, but its legacy is entangled with the social engineering and racial hierarchies that scarred South Africa for generations. You also discover the story of a remarkable figure, John Donne, a white man who became a Zulu chief and warrior. Donne is a symbol of the complicated, often contradictory relationships between colonizers and the colonized. He served as a mediator, a cultural bridge, but also as a man navigating two worlds fraught with tension. Donne's story invites you to reconsider simple narratives of us versus them. History, after all, is messy. Historians still argue over the degree to which the Anglo-Zulu War influenced later anti-colonial movements across Africa. Some suggest it inspired a new sense of resistance and unity among African peoples, showing that imperial forces could be challenged. Others point out that the British tightened their grip in the wake of the war, doubling down on control and repression. One thing is clear. The war's symbolism resonated far beyond Zululand's borders. It became a cautionary tale for colonial powers and a beacon of pride for those who fought against overwhelming odds. You think back to the famous imagery of the war, the disciplined ranks of Zulu warriors, the chaos of the British retreat, the desolation of Ulundi. These images live on in books, films, and oral traditions, shaping how generations understand the struggle between empire and indigenous sovereignty. And yet, the true story is more than just battle scenes and political consequences. It's about the human spirit, resilient, complex, and enduring. As the sun dips low again, you reflect on how history often repeats itself. Empires rise and fall, cultures clash and blend, and the voices of those who resist echo through time. You feel a quiet respect for the Zulu warriors who charged fearlessly into the unknown, for the British soldiers caught in a war they barely understood, and for the civilians, on all sides, whose lives were forever altered. Because history isn't just what's written in textbooks. It's the stories we tell when the lights go down and the world grows quiet. The days stretch on, but you're still carried along by the currents of history, drawn deeper into the tangled aftermath of the Anglo-Zulu War. As you trace the slow unraveling of Zululand sovereignty, the tangled political web thickens, and you realize the war's effects didn't just end with the clashing of spears and rifles. It reshaped identities, borders, and futures in ways that still puzzle scholars today. You find yourself following the British colonial administrators as they tighten their grip on the region. Their strategy is no longer just about military conquest. It's about control through political manipulation and economic dominance. The partitioning of Zululand into 13 chiefdoms was just the beginning. Each chiefdom ruled by men loyal to the British crown, often at odds with each other and their people. Imagine the tension in villages where ancient Zulu traditions collide with new colonial laws, where loyalty is split and suspicion is thick in the air like the smoke from evening fires. The British authorities imposed taxes, labor demands, and new courts, turning Zululand into a patchwork governed by unfamiliar rules. The social fabric, once held together by shared customs and the authority of the king, starts to fray. You can almost hear the whispered complaints of ordinary Zulu people, caught between respecting their chiefs and resisting foreign interference. Many chiefs, eager to maintain their power, enforced harsh policies to satisfy colonial overlords, creating resentment and further divisions. Here's a curious detail you stumble upon. The British sometimes relied on native police forces recruited from certain loyalist factions within the Zulu to suppress resistance and maintain order. This practice caused deep mistrust among communities as locals saw neighbors become enforcers for the colonial regime, a classic colonial tactic, pitting people against one another. The political intrigue doesn't stop there. You learn about the Zulu civil wars that erupted in the late 1880s and early 1890s, partly fueled by British divide-and-rule tactics. Rival claimants to the Zulu throne fought bitterly, with the British sometimes backing one side or the other, depending on their interests. The once unified Zulu nation was fractured, its leadership compromised. As you reflect on these events, you think about Cetshwayo's legacy. His return to Zululand was short-lived, but his memory endured as a symbol of resistance and unity. Some of his descendants continued to fight for recognition and autonomy, navigating the difficult terrain between colonial submission and cultural pride. Meanwhile, the broader region around Zululand is in flux. You discover how the Anglo-Zulu War affected relations with the Boer republics and the neighboring Basotho Kingdom. The British victory emboldened colonial ambitions, accelerating territorial disputes and skirmishes that would culminate in the Anglo-Boer Wars at the turn of the century. This interconnectedness of conflicts makes you realize that the Anglo-Zulu War was a significant thread in the complex tapestry of Southern African history. It was both a cause and consequence of the broader struggles for land, power, and identity in the region. Your thoughts turn to the cultural dimensions of this era. You hear stories of Zulu oral historians, griots who preserve the memories of battles, leaders, and everyday heroes through song and story. These narratives kept alive a version of history often at odds with colonial records. One fascinating insight is the way the Zulu integrated new elements into their traditions post-war. For instance, some adopted Christian practices introduced by missionaries but combined them with ancestral veneration in unique ways. This syncretism highlights the resilience and adaptability of culture even under duress. You're also struck by the role of women in this turbulent period. While the warriors fought on the front lines, Zulu women bore the brunt of upheaval, managing households, preserving traditions, and sometimes leading resistance efforts behind the scenes. Their stories, often overlooked, reveal a vital layer of the war's impact on society. On the British side, the war prompted soul-searching among military leaders and policymakers. The initial disaster at Isandlwana exposed flaws in intelligence, logistics, and respect for local conditions. Subsequent reforms aimed to professionalize colonial forces, improve communication, and better understand indigenous tactics. Yet, colonial attitudes remained patronizing and often brutal. The war reinforced racial hierarchies that justified exploitation and oppression. You see this tension play out in policies that restricted African land ownership and labor rights, setting the stage for institutionalized segregation. Historians still debate whether these policies were inevitable outcomes of empire or choices made by men blinded by prejudice and economic greed. This debate invites you to question how much agency indigenous peoples had in shaping their destinies amid colonial pressure. Your mind drifts to the environment, often a silent player in this saga. The Zululand landscape, its rivers, forests, and plains, both shaped and was shaped by the conflict. You learn that the British introduced new agricultural practices and infrastructure projects, altering the land to suit settler needs. Some scholars argue that these environmental changes contributed to long-term ecological disruption, affecting local livelihoods and traditions tied to the land. Others highlight indigenous resilience in adapting farming and hunting techniques despite these pressures. As night deepens, you realize that the Anglo-Zulu War's aftermath is a story of complexity, political, cultural, social, and environmental forces intertwining in unpredictable ways. It's a reminder that history is never tidy, and understanding it requires peeling back many layers. You feel the weight of these stories settling gently like dusk over the African veldt. The war was a thunderclap, but its echoes still murmur in the soil, in songs passed down, and in the lives of those who remember. The past feels alive, tangled and vibrant, inviting you to listen carefully and keep asking questions. The echoes of war settle into something more insidious as you step into the economic aftermath of the Anglo-Zulu conflict. It's not just the political fractures or cultural shifts that haunt this story. It's also the deep, grinding changes to the land and livelihoods that shape the fate of millions. You start by picturing the Zulu people, who had once lived in a relatively self-sufficient society based on cattle herding, agriculture, and trade. Their cattle weren't just livestock. They were wealth, social currency, even a form of identity. Losing control over land meant losing control over the very fabric of their economy and culture. After the British victory, land was systematically confiscated and redistributed, often to European settlers or companies interested in mining and farming. Zululand shrank like a patch of dry earth under the scorching sun, squeezed by fences, claims, and colonial laws. The cattle herds that had supported generations dwindled under the strain of disrupted grazing lands and new taxes. You can almost smell the dust rising from the overworked soil, hear the lowing of cattle lost to colonial greed. And here's a detail you might find strange. Some colonial officials believe cattle diseases could be a civilizing force, justifying the destruction of herds to control native populations. It's a harsh reminder of how biological warfare, or something close to it, played a role in subjugation. At the same time, many Zulu men found themselves pulled into the expanding colonial economy, but not as equals. Mines in Natal and the Transvaal beckoned with promises of wages, but these were meager and paid under brutal conditions. The migrant labor system emerged, creating cycles of separation between families and communities. Men would leave home for months or years, working in mines or farms, while women managed households and land. This economic disruption had deep social consequences. Families strained under the pressure, traditional roles shifted, and new social dynamics took root. Some Zulu adapted by diversifying their livelihoods, while others struggled to maintain cultural cohesion amid the pull of industrial labor. You stumble upon an anecdote about a Zulu miner who secretly smuggled home pieces of mining equipment, intending to build a workshop for his community, an early spark of resistance and self-reliance in the face of colonial exploitation. It's a small story, but it hints at the larger resilience brewing beneath the surface. Meanwhile, the colonial economy itself thrived on the extraction of resources and cheap labor, feeding the British Empire's industrial appetite. The wealth from mines in South Africa funded factories and railroads far from African soil, a stark contrast to the poverty experienced by many of the workers who dug it up. You start to connect dots about how this economic system entrenched racial inequality. Land laws prevented Africans from owning prime agricultural land, and labor policies restricted their mobility and wages. These systems didn't just shape South Africa, they laid groundwork for apartheid decades later. Historians still argue about how much agency African people had in navigating this oppressive economic order. Some emphasize acts of resistance, strike actions, sabotage, the formation of unions, while others highlight compromises and adaptations that ensured survival. The war's economic aftermath also affected British settlers. The military victory opened opportunities for land speculation, commercial farming, and business ventures. You can hear the optimistic chatter of settlers dreaming of wealth, sometimes oblivious to the costs borne by indigenous populations. On a more human note, you learn about the rise of mission stations, which combined religious conversion efforts with education and health services. These missions were complicated spaces. Some offered genuine support and empowerment. Others functioned as tools of cultural assimilation. You reflect on the ambivalence of missionary work, how it could erode traditional beliefs even as it provided literacy in medical care. The Zulu response was equally complex, ranging from enthusiastic conversion to strategic adaptation or outright resistance. Amid these transformations, the cultural life of the Zulu adapted too. Music, dance, and oral storytelling became vital ways to maintain identity and pass on history. You imagine gatherings where elders recount the tales of warriors and kings, children learning through song the names and deeds that colonial textbooks tried to erase. The environmental consequences of economic change also linger in your thoughts. Intensive farming, mining, and urban expansion altered landscapes that had nurtured generations. Some areas faced deforestation, soil erosion, and water scarcity, compounding hardships for local populations. You notice how these ecological changes interacted with social ones, how scarcity of resources sometimes heightened tensions between communities, while resilience and innovation found new expressions in agricultural techniques and communal land management. The Anglo-Zulu War's economic aftermath, then, is a story of loss and survival, exploitation and adaptation, where the legacies of colonial conquest intertwine with the enduring spirit of a people determined to endure. As the night deepens, you let these stories wash over you, their layers as complex as the African night sky, full of stars and shadows. As the night thickens, you delve deeper into the cultural ripple effects left in the wake of the Anglo-Zulu War. The battlefields may have quieted, but the echoes of that conflict continue to resonate through art, storytelling, and identity in ways both obvious and subtle. You begin by immersing yourself in the oral traditions of the Zulu people. For centuries, these stories were passed down from one generation to the next by Izimbanji, traditional praise poets, who wove history, myth, and current events into vibrant, rhythmic narratives. After the war, these storytellers became custodians not just of history, but of resilience. The narratives took on new layers, tales of heroism at Isandlwana, mourning for the fallen, and cautionary lessons about unity and leadership. These stories help the Zulu community process trauma and preserve a sense of identity amid profound upheaval. Imagine yourself sitting around a crackling fire, listening to a griot recite a song that vividly portrays the charge of the impi against British lines, the thunderous clash of shields and muskets, and the haunting silence that followed. It's a powerful mix of history and emotion, crafted to inspire and remind. Here's a quirky but revealing detail. Some Izimbanji adapted their storytelling styles in response to the presence of missionaries and colonial officials. They incorporated Christian symbolism and occasionally used English or Afrikaans phrases, blending worlds in a way that both preserved tradition and navigated colonial realities. This cultural flexibility became a form of quiet resistance, maintaining heritage while engaging with imposed change. You also explore how the war influenced Zulu visual arts. The intricate beadwork, once used to communicate social status or marital status, began to incorporate motifs reflecting the conflict, depictions of spears, shields, and commemorations of warriors. These designs became living memorials, personal and communal expressions of loss and pride. Meanwhile, British artists and writers, often removed from the realities on the ground, were fascinated by the drama of the war. Paintings of the battle scenes, sometimes romanticized or tinged with imperial propaganda, shaped European perceptions of Africa and its peoples. You find an interesting tidbit. The war inspired one of the first popular Zulu-themed theatrical productions in London, blending spectacle with a heavy dose of colonial stereotypes. It's a reminder of how cultural representation can both illuminate and distort. Back in Zululand, the post-war period saw a rise in cultural festivals and ceremonies aimed at reinforcing social bonds. The annual commemoration of battles, the honoring of ancestors, and the rituals surrounding cattle played crucial roles in community cohesion. You realize that culture here was not static. It was a living, breathing force adapting to new challenges. The Zulu people used their rich heritage not only to remember, but to imagine a future where their identity endured. Amid these celebrations and remembrances, women played a key role. They were keepers of tradition, teachers of the young, and sometimes creators of new art forms and ceremonies that reflected their experiences during and after the war. Their voices, often sidelined in official histories, shine through in these cultural expressions. On the scholarly front, historians and anthropologists still debate how much these cultural shifts were deliberate acts of preservation versus adaptive responses to survival pressures. The line between resistance and accommodation blurs, inviting reflection on how culture evolves under colonialism. You also uncover fascinating cross-cultural exchanges, the way Zulu music influenced neighboring groups, how colonial military bands borrowed from African rhythms, and how global interest in African culture began to stir. This cross-pollination of sounds and images hints at the complexities of identity in a colonized world. Not simply a binary of conqueror and conquered, but a fluid, ongoing dialogue. In the quiet moments, you consider how these cultural legacies persist today. Modern Zulu communities continue to celebrate their history through festivals, art, and language, reclaiming and reinterpreting their heritage in contemporary contexts. You're left with a sense of awe at the power of culture to endure and transform, even when the odds seem stacked against it. As the night hums softly around you, you feel a comforting connection to the storytellers and artists who refused to let history's wounds define their spirit. Because, after all, stories are how we keep the past alive and find our way forward. As the night wears on, you find yourself drawn into the complex web of the Anglo-Zulu War's influence on the wider southern African geopolitical landscape, a chessboard of ambitions, alliances, and betrayals that stretched far beyond Zululand's borders. Picture the British Empire, riding high on its imperialist dreams, but also feeling the sting of earlier setbacks like the Zulu victory at Insomnia. The war had exposed vulnerabilities in British colonial strategy, forcing a rethink not only in Zululand but throughout southern Africa. You begin with the Boer republics, the South African Republic, Transvaal, and the Orange Free State, whose leaders watched the Anglo-Zulu conflict with wary eyes. The Boers shared a tense relationship with both the British and the Zulu. They respected the military prowess of the Zulu, but also feared their own position might be threatened by shifting power balances. The British victory meant that Zululand was no longer a buffer against British expansion, and the Boers faced an emboldened empire pushing into the interior. This set the stage for increasing friction over land and political control, culminating in the Anglo-Boer Wars that followed in the next decades. You can almost hear the whispered councils of Boer leaders debating whether to resist British encroachment or to negotiate terms. Their ambivalence would soon erupt into brutal conflict that shaped the region's 20th century history. On the other side, the Basotho Kingdom, led by King Moshoeshoe I's successors, was also navigating these turbulent waters. The Basotho had their own struggles with both Boer and British encroachment. You learn how the Anglo-Zulu War indirectly affected their diplomatic maneuvers, as shifting alliances and colonial policies influenced their survival strategies. Meanwhile, the British continued their divide and rule tactics, exploiting rivalries between African groups to solidify control. You uncover examples of alliances with certain tribes against others, a classic colonial strategy that sowed long-lasting divisions. This brings you to one of the more contentious debates among historians. To what extent did the Anglo-Zulu War accelerate the disintegration of indigenous political unity in southern Africa? Some argue it was a decisive turning point that shattered centuries-old structures, while others suggest it was part of a longer process catalyzed by European colonization. Amidst this geopolitical chessboard, you notice the emergence of economic motivations intertwined with military ambitions. The discovery of gold and diamonds in South Africa heightened British interest in securing stable control over resource-rich territories. Zululand's defeat opened pathways for British infrastructure development, railways, ports, and roads that connected the interior to global markets. But these developments primarily benefited colonial interests, often at the expense of local populations. You find yourself imagining the scenes at the new railway stations. European businessmen stepping off trains with briefcases, indigenous workers loading goods, and the contrast between colonial prosperity and native hardship glaringly obvious. Yet resistance simmered beneath the surface. African leaders and communities sought new ways to assert autonomy, sometimes through negotiation, sometimes through armed struggle, and often through cultural resilience. You also discover the beginnings of African political organizations that later formed the foundation of anti-colonial movements. Though embryonic at this time, these groups planted seeds for the 20th century struggles for independence and civil rights. On the military front, the Anglo-Zulu War influenced tactics and technology in the region. The British Army incorporated lessons learned from the war into future campaigns, adjusting strategies to account for guerrilla tactics and unfamiliar terrain. Zulu warriors, meanwhile, adapted as well, incorporating new weapons and tactics, though constrained by colonial domination. This dynamic interplay of adaptation highlights the war's ongoing legacy. As you reflect, you realize the Anglo-Zulu War was far more than an isolated conflict. It was a pivotal moment that reshaped southern African geopolitics, setting in motion forces that reverberated through decades. You end this mental journey considering how these historical shifts still impact the region today. Borders drawn, identities formed, and memories kept alive all trace back to this era's upheavals. The war's shadows stretch long and wide, a testament to the tangled legacies of empire, resistance, and survival. Now the night deepens, and so too does your journey through the long, haunting legacy of the Anglo-Zulu War. You follow the clang of spears, the dusty boots of redcoats, the laments of poets, and the shifting lines on a colonial map. But here, in this quiet stretch, you begin to trace how the war carved its mark on identity itself. Not just Zulu identity, not just British colonial identity, but on the broader sense of self for generations caught in the aftermath. Because war doesn't end with the treaties. You carry its weight in memory, language, and the quiet rules people follow when they walk the land again. You begin with the Zulu. In the decades following the war, what it meant to be Zulu changed. The great warrior kingdom had been shattered, not just militarily, but symbolically. The institution of the monarchy was fragmented, the regimental system broken, and a people who once saw themselves as part of an invincible impi were now divided into administrative zones drawn by colonial pens. Yet, out of this fragmentation rose something oddly powerful. The image of the Zulu warrior, the shield bearer, the barefoot lightning bolt of Insomnia, took on a mythic quality. Zulu identity, instead of fading under colonial rule, hardened into a source of cultural pride. Even today, that legacy is worn like a mantle by many South Africans of Zulu descent. You probably didn't expect that the very act of colonization unintentionally strengthened cultural pride, but history's messy like that. This mythologizing wasn't confined to Zululand. In Britain, the Zulu War became a tale of stoic imperial courage, especially at Rorke's Drift. You picture schoolboys in Edwardian England reading about brave soldiers holding the line against savages, not knowing how narrow that lens was. That leads you to the strange world of British military culture. Medals from the Zulu War were polished and passed down. Rorke's Drift was reenacted in regimental halls. And let's not forget the 1964 film Zulu, a cultural artifact that both fascinated and infuriated audiences. Some hailed it for honoring bravery. Others condemned it for romanticizing colonialism and erasing African agency. Here's a quirky nugget. Zulu was reportedly one of Michael Caine's first big film roles. And even though he played a posh British officer, he was actually a working-class East Ender who'd never even held a rifle before. Ah, the magic of cinema. You also learn how the war inspired reenactments and battlefield tourism. Today, visitors can walk the plains of Insomnia, stand atop Rorke's Drift, and gaze at rusted memorials. But you can't help wondering, who tells those stories? And who are they told for? There's a discomfort in that question, because while the war left visible scars on the land, it also buried a lot in silence. Entire generations of Zulu families grew up without access to the full history, either because colonial schools ignored it or because telling it felt dangerous. Even today, many South Africans are still uncovering parts of that past in museums, archives, and family stories. You pause here, listening to the soft echo of a debated fact. Historians still argue whether the Zulu defeat led to cultural loss or cultural transformation. Did colonial rule erase indigenous identities? Or did it force them to evolve in ways that ensured survival? There's no neat answer. Some Zulu communities turned to Christianity. Others clung tightly to ancestral rituals. Some collaborated with colonial authorities for survival. Others rebelled quietly through underground ceremonies, music, and coded language. One thing is clear. The Anglo-Zulu War made identity political. No longer was it just about who you were. It became about who you could safely appear to be in a system that constantly watched and labeled. You explore the psychological legacy next. Trauma doesn't just linger in individuals. It lingers in communities. Stories of loved ones lost, lands taken, and ways of life destroyed passed down as cautionary tales, shaping how future generations see the world. This intergenerational memory helps explain why. Even today, the war still sparks strong feelings. In South Africa, debates over statues, colonial monuments, and renaming places tie back to this period. Each street name or stone monument becomes a battleground over memory. One of the most emotionally charged legacies is land. You walk through communities still displaced from ancestral lands, denied return by legal technicalities or political inertia. For them, the Anglo-Zulu War isn't just history. It's a lived reality, unfolding through courtrooms and protest marches. You also discover a global dimension. The war contributed to broader movements of Pan-Africanism in the 20th century. Zulu resistance inspired black intellectuals and activists around the world. Marcus Garvey, W.E.B. Du Bois, and later Nelson Mandela drew strength from the stories of African resistance, proof that colonized people had always fought back. And while we're on Mandela, here's a fun, almost poetic connection. When he was in prison on Robben Island, Mandela reportedly admired the military discipline and unity of Shaka Zulu's regiments, using that history as a blueprint for ANC organization and leadership. Past and present braided together like strands of grass. So what do you make of all this? The Anglo-Zulu War didn't end in 1879. It lived on, in names and rituals, in borderlines, in school curriculums, and yes, in bedtime history scripts like this one. It's a story that invites you to keep asking, what is victory, really? What endures after guns fall silent? Maybe it's the courage of those who keep telling the story. Maybe it's you listening now, letting the rhythm of these memories settle into your mind. The night is deep now. You feel the silence settle heavier around you, as if the land itself is waiting to exhale. You've traced bloodlines, battlefield footprints, and cultural aftershocks. But here, as you edge toward the conclusion, you begin to piece together how the Anglo-Zulu War shaped modern South Africa. Not just its history, but its politics, its land, its people. You begin with the obvious. The war led to the dismantling of the Zulu kingdom and the partitioning of its territory into 13 smaller chiefdoms. On paper, this might sound like bureaucratic tidiness. In reality, it was calculated disempowerment. The British High Commissioner, Sir Garnet Wolseley, believed breaking up Zululand would prevent another united uprising. Imagine this, a land once united by rhythm and ritual now carved into pieces like a meat pie, each chunk handed to a leader picked for loyalty to the crown. Some were former Zulu commanders, others were rivals of Setshwayo, men with grudges and ambitions now sanctioned by empire. This reshuffling sowed the seeds of internal conflict. The years immediately after the war were filled with civil war within Zululand. Factions clashing over legitimacy, identity, and access to dwindling resources. It's a detail often left out of Western textbooks, but the chaos wasn't over when the British declared peace. It just changed costume. By the late 1880s, the British annexed Zululand entirely, folding it into the colony of Natal. That move sealed the fate of the region. From then on, Zulu autonomy was illusionary, held together only in fragments of language, dress, and oral tradition. Fast forward, and you begin to trace the long, crooked line from annexation to apartheid. The patterns are disturbingly familiar. Land dispossession, administrative segregation, racial hierarchies, and economic exploitation. The Anglo-Zulu War became a kind of prototype for how the British and later white South African governments would manage native affairs. And yes, that's the term they used, native affairs, a cold phrase that masked deeply violent policies. Africans were removed from arable land and herded into reserves, which became precursors to the Bantustans of apartheid. The echoes are chilling. You find an often overlooked link here. Many of the laws used during apartheid had their roots in the colonial codes enacted after the Zulu defeat. Past laws, hut taxes, labor contracts, all mechanisms designed to extract from the African body while denying it dignity. Here's a quirky, biting irony. The same empire that praised the discipline of Zulu warriors at Rorke's Drift also used that stereotype to justify labor policies in mines and railroads. Strong, loyal, natural fighters, these backhanded compliments became shackles. And still, The Zulu spirit adapted. Resistance took on new forms: trade unions, underground churches, political movements. You trace a path from the military regiments of Shaka to the protest marches of the African National Congress. History didn't die. It morphed. You dwell now on the role of memory in nation building. Post-apartheid South Africa has struggled to reconcile its bloody past with its democratic aspirations. The Anglo-Zulu War, once a chapter used to glorify British imperialism, is now taught as a story of African resistance. But even that retelling comes with tension. Some South Africans view the focus on Zulu history as privileging one ethnic group over others. Others argue the war deserves more prominence in national consciousness. Museums, memorials, and school curriculums continue to wrestle with the question, whose history are we telling? You imagine a South African classroom today. A teacher holds up a picture of the Insomnia battlefield. A child raises her hand and asks, "Was this where we lost or where we fought?" And the teacher, caught in the complexity, answers both. One of the most powerful modern symbols of reconciliation came in 1999 on the 120th anniversary of the Battle of Insomnia. Zulu elders, British military descendants, and South African politicians gathered on the site. Prayers were said, flags were lowered, silence hung over the hill where bones still rest beneath the soil. Among the crowd were descendants of both British soldiers and Zulu warriors. Some had tears in their eyes. One wore a necklace made from spent bullet casings found in the dirt. Historians still argue whether these commemorations help heal or simply sanitize. Does a ceremony undo the centuries of pain? Can it? Should it? What's undeniable is this. The war left behind more than corpses. It left behind questions, identity, boundaries, stories, some told, many still waiting. In present-day KwaZulu-Natal, young artists draw inspiration from the legacy. Hip-hop lyrics reference Shaka. Sculptures depict Setshwayo not as a tragic figure, but as a resilient king. Political leaders invoke the war to galvanize support, for better or worse. And yet, the deepest resonance is perhaps the quietest one. The pride in being Zulu, not despite the war, but because of it. Because survival is resistance. Because memory is power. So when you next see a Zulu dance performed at a cultural festival, with shields pounding in rhythm and feet striking earth, know that you're witnessing more than a performance. You're watching centuries of memory wrapped in every stomp, every chant, every call to the ancestors. And when a British descendant visits the Insomnia Memorial and lays a wreath of poppies, you're seeing the beginning, not the end, of understanding. This war wasn't just about Britain and Zululand. It was about how power reshapes the human soul. How dignity bends, but doesn't always break. How stories, if told truthfully, can point the way forward. You listening now are part of that ongoing story. You're still here, and the end is near. But tonight's journey doesn't fade gently. It deepens. Because now you finally come to the most haunting legacy of all, what the Anglo-Zulu War tells US about empire itself. Not the pomp and parade version, the real one. The kind that slips into places it doesn't belong, redraws maps, demands taxes, offers treaties with hidden teeth, and always, always tells itself that it came to help. It's strange, isn't it? How wars like this one get remembered as victories or tragedies, but rarely as patterns. You've seen it before, you'll see it again. From West Africa to India to the Caribbean to the Middle East, this same dance of civilizing missions, conquest cloaked as diplomacy, treaties broken faster than promises whispered under gunpowder skies. So you step back now, as if you're floating above the battlefield. The red earth of Zululand stretches below. You can see the line of the British columns winding like ants across the veldt. You can see the impis circling, swift and silent. You can see Setshwayo pacing in his hut, torn between defiance and duty. And you can see Sir Bartle Frere calmly reading dispatches as he engineers a war no one elected. What strikes you most is how calculated it all was. The war didn't happen because of rage or revenge. It happened because of paperwork, of profit, of politics. Britain wanted a confederation of southern African colonies, and Zululand stood in the way. The Zulu were strong, united, and inconvenient. And inconvenient people, historically, don't last long when empire wants clean lines and open minds. That's the story you don't hear in Sunday school or cozy museum plaques. You don't hear about the gold under the hills or the railroads that needed labor. You don't hear how the Zulu weren't just warriors. They were landowners, cattle traders, husbands, wives, children, people. The Anglo-Zulu War was pitched as inevitable, but you followed it too far now to believe that. It was engineered, crafted. It was part of a system that believed, truly and terribly, that white rule was a moral good. Historians still argue whether the British public even understood what was happening. Some suggest they were fed a carefully curated tale of savage hordes and noble defense. Others think the public simply didn't care. Either way, the machinery kept grinding. You picture Queen Victoria, far away in her palace, receiving reports written in neat cursive. The words dispatched and secured and pacified do so much to hide the screams. Meanwhile, on the Zulu side, stories were passed in songs and whispers. You imagine a grandmother humming lullabies about fallen sons, a father showing his child the place where the cornfield once grew before the soldiers came. Those memories aren't kept in books. They're kept in bloodlines. You pause now, reflecting on the two narratives the war produced. One of empire fulfilled, the other of identity wounded. One made its way into textbooks and medals, the other into graves without names. It's here that the war's lesson crystallizes, not in strategy or heroism, but in the cost of forgetting. Because if you forget Insomnia, you forget that sometimes the less powerful can outthink and outfight the world's largest empire. If you forget Rourke's drift, you forget the complexity of bravery, even when it's serving a dark cause. If you forget Setchwayo's plea for peace before the first shot, you forget how often wars are started not by warriors, but by men in suits chasing maps and minerals. And if you forget the civil war that followed, you forget how colonialism doesn't stop when the guns do. So where does it all lead? You return now to modern South Africa, a place where skyscrapers rise next to shantytowns, where English and Zulu exist side by side, sometimes in harmony, sometimes not, where statues fall and are replaced with murals, where land claims stretch back to 1879, where the past is not a museum, but a mirror, and across the world, the echoes continue. In Britain, reckoning with empire is still uncomfortable. Debates rage over whether to teach colonial history properly in schools. Spoiler, many still don't. Meanwhile, scholars unearth letters, battlefield artifacts, censored reports, each one chipping away at the clean, heroic version of empire once told in marbled halls. Here's a strange fact to carry with you. The British never formally apologized for the invasion of Zululand. Not in any official capacity. Not even after democracy came to South Africa. Not even in passing. It tells you something, doesn't it? About the weight of history. About who gets to tell it. About how hard it is for institutions to admit they were wrong, even centuries later. But people can change. People do tell the stories, especially when they're passed down late at night. In rooms like this one, with voices like yours, curious, maybe tired, but awake to the truth. And here's one last quirky echo. In 2006, a group of descendants from British and Zulu soldiers held a soccer match near Insomnia. Not for show, just for fun. No medals, no speeches, just a ball, laughter, and the sound of feet pounding the same soil where their ancestors had once fought. If that's not legacy, what is? So here we are. The war that began with an ultimatum and ended with a kingdom shattered now rests in memory. not stone. And tonight you carried it. You listened, you imagined, you felt it move through you. That is the beginning of something powerful. Because remembering is resistance. And sleep? Sleep is the quiet where resistance grows. Now close your eyes. Let the battlefields fall silent. Let the shields lower. Let the red coats vanish into dusk. Let the songs of the ancestors rise softly like wind through tall grass. The night has deepened, and your journey is nearly done. Take a slow breath. The distant sounds of marching boots and chanting warriors have faded. The cries and cannon blasts of empire have stilled. In their place, only the soft wind remains, brushing over hills that once echoed with war, now blanketed in silence and moonlight. You've walked alongside kings and colonels, listened to their ambitions, their fears, their pride. You've stood on bloody ground, and you've seen what history tries to hide in its polished summaries. You know now that the Anglo-Zulu war wasn't just a clash of arms. It was a battle over memory, identity, and survival. You've heard the heartbeat beneath the footnotes. And now, that weight, you can let it go. Let it settle like dust on the shield of a warrior who's finally returned home. Let it curl into the earth like the roots of an old tree that still stands, even after the storm. You're safe now. You are still. The story is behind you. So drift gently, knowing you carry a deeper truth than before. And as you slip towards sleep, remember this. Empires fall, flags fade, but memory, honest, stubborn memory, stays. It stays in the stories you pass down, in the names you refuse to forget, in the quiet understanding that history is not just what happened, but what matters. Sleep easy, traveler. You've walked a long way tonight. End of script. Sweet dreams.